You're listening to Talking Africa. My name's Nick Norbrook. Thanks for joining. Talking Africa is brought to you by the Africa Report. We're the leading source of information, analysis, news, and views from the continent. Check us out at theafricareport.com. My guest today is Mark Suzman, the CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He sits astride one of the biggest charitable endeavours on the planet, a $50 billion endowment that has, in the last 18 months, thrown itself at the COVID-19 pandemic, funding all manner of research and vaccine trials, and now the COVAX scheme itself. We talk about global collective action problems, the new malaria vaccine, and many other things. But I start by asking Mark about the state of the COVID-19 vaccine uptake globally, which has seen rich countries rush to the front of the queue, leaving many African countries months and months away from a serious rollout.
80% of all vaccines that have been distributed, which are now in the many billions, have gone to high-income and upper-middle-income countries, and low-income countries, of which the vast majority are African, have still only barely reached 2%. And so that's just at any level, at a moral level, at a public health level, at an economic level, it just makes no sense. And in the context of the numbers of vaccine availability, and there's some newer numbers that have come out that you've probably seen that Affinity and others have done, which are, it's just been partly very difficult to track the volume of vaccine manufacturing and the tools. But it is now clear, there is clear evidence that in the coming weeks and months, there will be significant additional surplus capacity in developed countries that could and should be used and distributed and would have a much higher global health impact being used and distributed as first and then second dose in Africa and other developing countries that are left behind. And so I think the imperatives are twofold. One is to really try and help accelerate the provision of vaccines to COVAX. COVAX had to scale back yet again its targets yesterday, and some of those are because of manufacturing and regulatory issues, but some of it is just simply supply issues and meeting contracts that they have reached with the vaccine manufacturers but are not being fulfilled. And then there are also the provisions that AVAT, which the African Union's own vaccine acquisition task force has done, which is now starting to have an impact. And so the combination of that, what you need is, accelerating the COVAX and AVAT sort of purchases and acquisition, and very much accelerating the donation of additional doses from wealthier countries that have already stockpiled much more than is needed for their own populations are the two most obvious interventions. And our hope, it now looks like, and President Biden will shortly be announcing a summit at the United Nations General Assembly to talk about these issues, and we think that should be the highest priority.
How do we make the argument that COVID is not just a rich world problem? The IMF say that a new COVID variant lockdown might cost in the trillions of dollars, but that a fully comprehensive global vaccine rollout might cost $50 billion. And this is the IMF chief economist who ran the numbers back earlier this year. And it seems like we have a fundamental collective action problem. And so I guess, in terms of what the foundation does, how can you build coalitions that, bridge this difficult nationalistic era in which we now live, and, move us to a point where we can start to deliver on promises?
Yeah, so that is exactly the right question. And yes, we collaborated and provided some technical input into the IMF when they were doing that set of calculations about the 50 billion, and because it is so clearly, as I said at the start, the right thing to do by any calculus. even if you reject the moral argument, which I don't think people should do, that higher risk populations should be, and certainly healthcare workers should be vaccinated ahead of lower risk populations elsewhere, the public health risk about, the risk of extra variants developing that might be more vaccine resistant and the knock-on effect, and simply the global benefits, even without new variants, of allowing a fuller recovery of full economic transactions, including travel, just make this a sort of a classic no-brainer. But what is rational at a global level becomes very challenging in the context of domestic politics, where each national government is, listening to constituencies, worried about, the need to hoard booster shots against particular potential new variants, et cetera, even though the science is still quite tenuous about the needs for that. And so, it's important to remember two aspects. One is the intent. The world did try in the establishment of COVAX, which we were very involved and engaged and included African and European countries. At the time, the United States very conspicuously in the Trump administration did not participate in the formation of COVAX. But the intent was that the vision was we should have a global model that provides equal contemporaneous access for 20% coverage of healthcare workers and high-risk populations across rich and poor world alike. That concept remains the right model and concept for the world to do. It's the way we should have operated, and it ran into the reality of nationalist politics and then competitive purchases, which to some degree was exacerbated, although the United States research and development investments do deserve a lot of credit, because what they invested in Operation Warp Speed, the many billions of dollars, actually helped lead to the generation of those vaccines. The fact that the United States so conspicuously then was not participating in COVAX and was massively making direct contracts for its own provision, again under the Trump administration, almost pushed a number of other countries to say, well, we better do the same. And so you had an unhealthy political dynamic, which we hope is now very much changing, that the Biden administration, one of its first acts was to join COVAX. It's now the largest funder of COVAX. It's now the largest bilateral provider of donations. None of this is yet at the scale we think it could or should be, and that's what our hopes for this upcoming summit at the UN will be, to make much more concrete commitments. Because while there were some initial commitments made at the G7, I haven't seen the current statistics, but I think of the roughly 800 million doses they were committing then, I think only about 15% of those have yet been provided. And so there's clearly, even to meet existing commitments, there needs to be an acceleration. And then now that we know we are getting the supply available, meaning that manufacturing is going to start hitting critical thresholds, certainly by the fourth quarter of this year and the first quarter of next year. And the key is to then get those provided and acquired. And so I think we have the tools, and there is now more attention and momentum around it. But you're right, it has been a great case study of a collective action failure, even though there was a vehicle to allow a sort of good collective action opportunity that was set up at the right time.
Journalists, like politicians, are very fond of spending other people's money. But I mean, just allow me to play devil's advocate for a second. If it's 50 billion that we're looking for, why does the Gates Foundation, for example, not stand up and say, we'll take 10 or 20 billion of this and call around a few friendly philanthropic friends and just knock this on the head?
Yes, well, the Gates Foundation, and the main part of the Goalkeepers report, we're focusing straight on vaccine inequality. But, what the report shows is the broader economic and social impact. The Sustainable Development Goals are what development is fundamentally about. And the 18 indicators that we track there, which range from, preventable child mortality, to poverty reduction, to agricultural productivity, to nutrition and stunting, to access to financial inclusion, sanitation. These are all critical development goals that the world has signed up for and that are absolutely essential and prioritized by every single African government. The bulk of our resources go to those activities. our COVID response, and we have committed an additional $1.8 billion in the last year to COVID response on top of the $5 billion that we provide every year across the other priorities, because none of those went away. It's not as if, in fact, the report says it's not as if HIV, TB, and malaria took a pause during COVID. In fact, the risks increased. The report shows that childhood vaccination rates dropped. They didn't drop as badly as we were concerned they would, partly because of strong action by African and other governments to do catch-up campaigns, but they've still dropped 7%. That's put us down at 2005 vaccination rates from 2019 ones. And so our primary focus, we think, our primary value add is continuing that important work and then providing leverage support, and we are funders of COVAX, but this is something that could and should be provided at a global level as a public good, so which is why we're using our advocacy voice around that. And it should have three broad dimensions. In its ideal space, what you would have is significant commitments from high-income countries to COVAX, particularly to support the poor, the low-income countries. They should, in an ideal world, have fully subsidized vaccine access. That's what Gavi exists to provide for the 57 poorest countries. And then the World Bank has committed $12 billion now they've increased it to $20 billion in what they're calling medical countermeasures. Much of that is being used for vaccine purchasing at the moment. We understand why that becomes a rational response by governments, but in an ideal world, that would be being used and prioritized for actually the development of healthcare infrastructure. This is the developing countries' own money that is intended to be spent in those countries. And one of the opportunities, and the flip side, it's not just about vaccine procurement. We actually have to focus on creating the delivery infrastructure to make sure that we can get vaccines to those who need them, which we know even from the efforts of high-income countries is actually very challenging. We don't normally have infrastructure to get to healthy adults. The vaccine infrastructure is normally for children. And so there's an opportunity to use those resources and also use them for key, commodities and support like oxygen provision or, some of the therapeutic provisions, which will have long-term impact. The oxygen supplies help the COVID response, but then also help pneumonia treatment going forward, or the treatment of, at-risk births for expectant mothers, etc. And then last but not least, there is the effort by the IMF now to have the special drawing rights, which have now been approved, is $650 billion, which most of those have obviously been allocated to wealthy countries, although there are significant resources being made available for developing countries. And ideally, again, those would be used in the same way that the economic stimulus funds that wealthy countries are able to access and poorer countries cannot, for broader economic recovery, to look at the poverty reduction, or alleviating the impact on poverty. Because as you hopefully saw from the report, one of the other distressing findings is that there are 31 million more people in extreme poverty now, the majority of which were pushed into extreme poverty in Africa. These are from our good news stories of the 2000s, where even across most of Africa, we saw steady reductions in absolute poverty measured on $1 a day for 20 years of progress. And one of the reasons we do these goalkeepers reports is to highlight that progress. This is a massive setback, and that's measured in terms of families suddenly unable to provide enough food and support for their children. That has knock-on effects on nutrition and stunting. So, sorry, somewhat longer answer perhaps than you were looking for, but I think it is really important that while everyone is focused on the health crisis, the lingering impact of the health crisis is about the ongoing social and economic impact well beyond the direct implications of COVID that we need to address.
I mean, as you say, it isn't just a financing problem, is it? And COVAX has put a spotlight on what a lot of African healthcare professionals have known for a long time. And you touched on it just then, that the critical infrastructure that gets vaccines into cold chains, into well-administered public health systems with doctors and nurses in far-flung areas, not just the capital cities. That's often what's lacking, and that I imagine will take, a multi-decade effort. What are your long-term, in terms of, you've been in contact with partners on the African continent for a long time. Do you see them using this particular crisis as an opportunity to really start planning in a more sustained and sustainable way in terms of healthcare?
The short answer is yes. It's early signs, but there was already momentum moving towards this even before the COVID crisis. That some of the big global initiatives like the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, like the Global Fund to Fund HIV, TB, and malaria, which are significant funders, have historically often created or worked on parallel supply chains around their particular different supply chains and systems for the antiretrovirals versus the vaccines issues, and they've all increasingly seen the need to align on health system strengthening. The Global Finance Facility at the World Bank, and we're supporters for finances of all three of those initiatives, is very deliberately an attempt to have national governments put together comprehensive, which is looking at primary healthcare reform, in particular across family planning, maternal health, nutrition, reproductive health, and how that the health systems can support and how we can crowd in more funding around that. So these tools were being put in place and were being used imperfectly. COVID has, underlined how critical it is to make sure that, the recovery is a both and. As you say, we do these extensions into supply chains, into the provision of community health, because most of these vaccinations will have to happen at the community level, but leave in place infrastructure that is going to be broader and able to deal with the wider array of health needs. And there are other areas of the response that have huge potential here. So we've been again early supporters of the African Pathogen Genomic Sequencing Initiative, which the African CDC is doing, which are now setting up some African labs and others to do. That is clearly critically important for tracking the vaccine variants. Everyone in the world has now discovered that, because you need to find and discover a variant as quickly as possible in order to, address any particular challenges. But in Africa, again, these are tools that, done right, will be much more helpful in terms of providing more crystallized regional mapping around, say, high-burden malaria incidents, to allow you to then do, and in fact, we cite in the report example of Benin as one example, which is doing a much more targeted malaria response into high burden areas with now digitized bed nets, so you can actually track if the bed nets are going to the areas, these are models which actually have high promise to accelerate the treatment of malaria going forward. So, we think there is a real opportunity for a both and here. Focus on those health system structuring, make sure you're doing the COVID specific outcomes in the short term, but leave in place something that's going to allow us to address the broader health challenges that Africa continues to face.
So let's talk about some of those, more positive things to emerge in more detail, particularly on malaria. You mentioned the fact that actually the vaccines for other diseases weren't hit quite so bad. We don't yet have a vaccine for malaria, but there have been some interesting trials in Burkina Faso. Do the sort of the broader, scientific progresses made in mRNA and other newer forms of vaccine have also a spillover here? And particularly in malaria, where do you think this will take us?
Yes, well, in malaria, there is actually one vaccine which has provisional WHO approval and is being used in several African countries in a pilot. It's one that we were the primary funders of helping develop, Muscarix, but it's unfortunately, has limited efficacy. It doesn't last as long as it might. It doesn't have the kind of 90% levels of efficacy that we've seen for the COVID vaccines, but it doesn't lead us to lose hope. We certainly think a vaccine in malaria can and should be a game changer. And there are multiple routes. There's some other, ones you mentioned the Burkina Faso trials. And yes, absolutely on mRNA. In fact, we first got involved in mRNA as the Gates Foundation over 5 years ago, back when it was seen as a little bit of a pipe dream in the scientific community. And we were early investors in CureVac and BioNTech. And part of that reason is that those companies were primarily at the time looking at cancer as treatment, and we thought, well, this is a promising that, could our investments actually maybe turn these into platforms that might work for malaria or TB or HIV, and that is actually the condition of our investments are to make sure that that's the focus. And indeed, BioNTech has now announced a major initiative on malaria, partnership with the Europeans. I actually joined the announcement. We'll be participating with them to explore the development and acceleration of both the malaria mRNA vaccine combined with manufacturing capacity in Africa. So yes, these could be very, very considerable silver linings of a much more accelerated approach. And, we'll be looking for the same in TB and HIV, and those three remain the largest, the infectious diseases that are the largest killers across Africa.
You mentioned manufacturing capacity. We have, there's been announcements of COVID vaccine manufacturing capacity in Africa, and a lot of criticism saying this is only 20%, 25% of the full manufacturing. Do you think, nevertheless, it will at least get 3, 4, 5 African countries on the route to the same kind of pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity as an India has today? And how important is it that Africa domesticates medical, technological, and manufacturing progress?
Yes, so in the broader vaccine universe, it needs to be a both and. We're constantly looking, and we've worked across 10 different developing countries over the last 2 decades to try and expand manufacturing capacity, including 2 African ones, Senegal and South Africa, because we see that as a critical platform going forward, and that's been for other vaccines separate from COVID. The things about vaccine manufacturing to remember is, it's much more technologically complex in terms of the regulatory and other requirements, because it's just a much higher bar. You're not manufacturing a generic headache pill. You're putting something into an otherwise healthy human that might make them sick. And so some people underestimate the complexity of how you develop those plants, and that's why it's actually critically important not just to have the manufacturing capacity, but the regulatory capacity. And we are definitely looking at ways to support the African Union and other things, in developing that regulatory capacity along with the manufacturing base. And yes, I think we've learned the lesson of the current response is that India, in fact, as the Gates Foundation, we had actually provided some of the funding to the Serum Institute of India, which was intended to provide the vaccines for COVAX, which then the Indian government, very understandably, chose to not let leave the Indian border when they had their big crisis. And so I think the need for some African manufacturing capacity is very important, and we're seeing some of the early stages with now the Aspen manufacturing that's now providing J&J doses for the continent. And so in a few countries developing and building that up. The one other point to make, though, is it can't be focused. Everyone's very focused on the COVID vaccine right now, but we are likely to have significant volumes and indeed surpluses ultimately of COVID vaccines, hopefully by the middle of next year. What you want is an ongoing pipeline. We have many vaccine needs across the continent, and so we need to be thoughtful about which vaccines would make the most sense to vaccinate domestically, where are the greatest needs, because you want an ongoing business model that keeps these entities viable. And so these are all areas that we will be leaning in to work that's with an interesting, the AU with a number of countries. We're always looking at the use of philanthropic capital, that we should not be displacing or driving things that governmental or private sector capital could or should be doing better. That's why we want to go. So back to your COVAX, yes, we could do that, but there really is a role of public therapy. It is a clear global public health good, and we will want to galvanize that. Something like the malaria vaccine is an example of a clear market failure. That there are huge needs. It kills, many thousands of people and children every year across the continent of Africa. The knock-on economic impact is huge, but there's no incentive for big Western pharmaceutical companies to invest in a malaria vaccine because any Westerner going can take a prophylactic and not get malaria. So what we can do is then backstop the market failures and say, okay, well, we will provide that market. We will provide the incentives for the big research and development innovations, and we'll tend to do it often in that would be things for climate resistant crops, and because we know that that's also where Africa is already seeing some of the biggest risks of flood and drought needs. Some of those just become then public goods. We've also learned that you still need to invest. If you create these things, it doesn't mean, to the discussion we've just had on vaccines, it'll automatically reach the people who need them. And so the other bit is, how do you seed and maximize the role of these multilateral entities like a COVAX, like an AU in Africa, the AMSP, which provided the platform for purchasing dexamethasone and oxygen, now AVAT. Some of these regional platforms, I think, are really important potential things, the role of the Africa CDC. So, yeah, I think it would be a combination of those, but we're constantly would be looking at areas where we're leveraging something that needs to be sustainable for the long term. Philanthropy should be, a gap filler, a catalyst, a galvanizer, but ultimately it's the responsibility of sort of governments to drive forward long-term impact.
Our thanks to Mark Suzman. If you want to subscribe to a free daily email to keep you up to date on everything we put out, please sign up at theafricareport.com. I'm Nick Norbrook. Thanks for listening.